I'm Rabbi Lustig. I want to welcome you to this evening for our Amram Scholar Series. I want to thank, I hope you can see that I'm joined by Leslie Maitland here and Professor Robert Mnookin. And we're so delighted to have this opportunity. I'd like to go through, since we have the pleasure of joining by Zoom, to just let you know that we're going to ask that everybody remain muted during the time, and we may, if there's somebody whose phone or something goes off of that, we will hit a mute all. We hope to be able, and up in the right-hand corner of your, if you take your cursor and go up to the right-hand corner and hit three dots, you will see that you can at any time, if you want to, spotlight, but we've asked to our left, to my, well, on the screen, as well as Rich Gordon, a member of our staff. He's waving now. If you have any technical problems, in the chat box, Rich has put in his email, and he is very good at this. And we will, between the two of us, will be trying to go through and highlighting those who are speaking. For example, I will spotlight myself there. So we'll try to give you that. If you don't want to have me or whoever's doing filling your screen, if you go up to the top, there's usually something called gallery view. You can hit that and it'll go back to a screen that gives you multiple images. I love the fact that I can see so many of our congregants and so many of you. I'm delighted that you have joined us this evening. There's nothing more than we have the opportunity, and tonight is an experiment in the sense that Leslie Maitland had put together such a profoundly wonderful series for our Amram Scholar Series. Has been the history of our Amram Scholar Series, and certainly the record of Leslie's work for us. She will talk a little bit about what we're going to do, but tonight is an opportunity in which we're decided that we would bring one of our scholars live on Zoom rather than just through video, although we have had great attendance to the Sundays that have been video streaming or video, which Leslie will explain how you can access those and the opportunity. So I'm going to get underway the best I can and begin this evening. Identity in America and its difficulties in the face of injustice have brought thousands, if not millions, to the streets. But the core questions are far from the end of this situation. The core questions of identity also resonate for us as Jews. Who and what are the parameters of American Judaism? How do we define identity? And how do we decide who and who is not part of the Jewish community? What are these points of access and these points of exclusion? In his incredible book, The Jewish American Paradox, Embracing Choice in a Changing World, this compelling book is completely and also totally Jewish in its content. It supposes, because its content is so purposeful, but its questions are even more profound. Spurred by his own daughter's questions of Jewish identity in name only, sent our professor on a journey. And we tonight, and through his book and the Amram Scholar Series, are the benefactors. We are delighted to have with us Robert M. Mnookin, the Samuel Wilson Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, the chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, and the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. He has written or edited numerous scholarly articles and 9 books, including Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight, and most recently, Kissinger, the Negotiator, Lessons from Deal-Making at the Highest Level. Before joining Harvard faculty, Professor Mnookin was the Albert H. Sweet Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, the director of the Stanford Center on Conflict and Negotiations. At Stanford, he also chaired the Jewish Community Federation, served as the president of the Stanford Hillel Foundation, and between 1994 and 2003, he served as the International Board of the New Israel Fund as its treasurer. He's presently the vice president of the Harvard Hillel Foundation and on the International Advisory Board of the Israel Democracy Institute. Professor received his AB in economics from Harvard College, his law degree, and after serving as a law clerk to Supreme Court John M. Harlan, he practiced law in San Francisco before becoming a law professor, first at Berkeley, then at Stanford. His book is incredibly compelling. I complained to him earlier that I tried to go through and take a book that I'd read almost a year ago and skim. It's impossible. His examples are compelling. His writing is so anticipatory, and I'm so delighted he joins us tonight for what is perhaps one of the most critical questions that faces the Jewish community, and that is, how do we define ourselves? And based on that definition, how do we move into an effective future as an American Jewish community? So without further ado, it is my honor to present Professor Mnookin.
Rabbi Lustig, thank you for that much too generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you, and I only wish my wife and I could be back in Washington. We lived there for 2 years, many years ago, to do this in person, but I'm pleased to be able to do it at all. And Leslie, thank you for arranging all of this. My book is about the puzzling nature of Jewish identity, the vexing question of who should count as Jewish in America, and the challenges facing the American Jewish community. Looking back, I think the seed for this project, although I hardly knew it at the time, was planted in a family dinner table conversation in Oxford, England, when my daughters forced me to confront my own ambivalence about being Jewish and the vexing question of who counts as Jewish. I was spending a sabbatical semester in Oxford with my family, and my wife Dale and I had enrolled both our daughters, Jennifer then age 11 and Allison age 8, in English schools. Over dinner, actually the first week of school, Jennifer told us about her new class, RE. I asked her what RE stood for, and she said religious education. She reported that it was taught by the formidable Miss K, the headmistress of the school. Miss K asked in the first session of this class, who here is Anglican? Jennifer reported that almost everyone raised her hand. Then Miss K asked, do we have any Presbyterians? A few more kids raised their hands. Catholics, a couple more. Finally, she asked, is there anyone here not of the Christian faith? I asked Jennifer what happened next. Well, I raised my hand, and Miss K gave me a funny look and asked, and what are you, my dear? I told her I'm Jewish. Miss K paused for a second and then said, oh, how interesting. Then she asked whether my parents would object if as part of this course we read parts of the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. And I told her that you would not object. Well, Dale and I immediately reported to Jennifer that she had responded quite appropriately. I tried to be psychologically astute, so I asked her, how did all this make you feel? She looked at us and asked, when are we going to actually become Jewish? Dale and I were a little stunned. I responded, slightly defensively, your mother and I have always thought of ourselves as Jewish. We're not really religious, but we are Jewish. Left unsaid, but implicit, was the idea I had grown up with. Being Jewish was not something you needed to become. You just were, whether you liked it or not. By birth, Dale and I were Jews, therefore, so was Jennifer. Descent alone was enough. One thesis of my book is that for my grandchildren's generation in America and for subsequent generations, this will no longer be true. Jennifer, to her credit, was not satisfied when I told her that we had always thought of ourselves as Jewish. She shot back, "You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do," I responded. Out of the blue, she said, "I want to have a bat mitzvah." Dale and I looked at each other, a little bit baffled. Where had this idea come from? Not from us. Neither Dale nor I had been bar or bat mitzvahed. We had grown up in the Midwest, I in Kansas City, Dale in St. Louis, in highly assimilated families. Our parents and grandparents were longtime members of Reformed Jewish congregations, which at the time in St. Louis and Kansas City, at least to the congregations we belonged to, did not celebrate bar or bat mitzvahs. No Hebrew school for us. Instead, like our Protestant friends, we'd been sent to Sunday school at our temple until 10th grade when we were confirmed. Twice a year, our parents took us to services on the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We received presents for both Hanukkah and Christmas, the latter celebrated as a secular holiday with gifts under a Christmas tree. Unlike our parents, Dale and I had never bothered to join a temple, even after our children were born. As a young couple living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then Washington, D.C., and finally Berkeley, in the late 60s and 70s, we had never felt any social pressure to do so. This, by the way, is quite unlike growing up in the Midwest. Will Herberg's book, Protestant Catholic Jew, really captured what for me seemed true at the time. You had to belong to one of the three teams, and everybody belonged to a congregation. There was no sitting it out entirely. But now our daughter was telling us that our passive form of being Jewish wasn't good enough. Meanwhile, 8-year-old Allison sat quietly eating her dinner. She says to us, "I'm the only American kid in my class, and I'm probably the only Jewish kid, but no one's asked, and I haven't said anything. I don't see any reason to bring it up." Boy, could I relate to the approaches of both my daughters. As an assimilated Jewish kid growing up in Kansas City, I had learned to be very quiet about my Jewish identity. If someone inquired if I were Jewish, I would raise my hand. But if no one asked, I wouldn't bring it up. It was not that I was afraid of anti-Semitism. I personally I never recall encountering a single anti-Semitic remark growing up. But I was aware that being Jewish was somehow different and that I wasn't supposed to make an issue out of it. The idea wasn't to deny being Jewish, but to fit in. I certainly never had any sense that being Jewish was somehow an advantage. In fact, it was clear to me that it was a disadvantage. I was fully aware that Jews were a minority and that social discrimination still existed, and it did exist in Kansas City. The all-male prep school I attended there had an unacknowledged Jewish quota of about 10%. I was one of 5 Jewish kids in my class out of about 50. Absorbing all of this as a teenager, I gathered that I was supposed to be proud of being Jewish on the one hand, but to downplay it on the other, and not to let it get in the way of my brilliant career. I handled these mixed messages by accepting my Jewish heritage, if not exactly embracing it, and then thinking about it as little as possible. Since I wasn't religiously inclined, this approach worked for me well into adulthood. But now Jennifer, our daughter, was challenging Dale and me to arouse ourselves from our apathy and step up and affiliate for her sake. So we told her that when we returned to Berkeley, we would join a temple and enroll her in religious school so she could begin cramming for her bat mitzvah. My response to Jennifer's challenge turned out to be only a tiny step on the journey that led to this book. I call it a tiny step because initially I didn't do much more than write a check. My book identifies 4 challenges that I see facing the American Jewish community. One of the 4 challenges, illustrated by my story, is that for many of us, our commitment to Judaism as a religion is thin. While the overwhelming majority of American Jews report they take pride in being Jewish, with the exception of the Orthodox, we American Jews are less observant than our Christian neighbors, at least if measured by attendance at religious services or membership in a church or synagogue. Only about a third of American Jews belong to a synagogue. Many are not believers. Nearly half of the Pew respondents in the 2013 Pew report say that they are agnostic or do not believe in God at all. 22% of those who identify themselves as Jewish also reported that they have no religion, what Pew called Jews without Judaism. That figure balloons to nearly a third among millennials. The challenge for Jews like me, and it's no small challenge, is to clearly articulate to our children and grandchildren what our Jewish identity consists of and which values we hope to pass along. My second story is about the youngest of my 4 grandchildren, Eli Olcott. It illustrates what many see as the second great challenge to the American Jewish community, intermarriage. The name on Eli's birth certificate is, believe it or not, Cornelius Olcott VI. With our enthusiastic blessing, our daughter Allison married a wonderful young man, Corey Olcott, whose real name is Cornelius Olcott V. Needless to say, Corey was not raised in the Jewish faith. This was not a big deal to Dale or me, nor were the Olcotts concerned that Allison was Jewish. That Allison married someone who's not Jewish is hardly exceptional. Today, among Jews in America, intermarriage is the norm, not the exception. The statistics are stunning. Since the year 2000, 57% of American Jews who married wed non-Jews. This represents a stunning change. Traditional Jewish law prohibited intermarriage. Indeed, among observant Jews, they would sit Shiva, that is, say the prayer for the dead, if someone married outside the faith. In my grandparents' generation, intermarriage for Jews was exceedingly rare. The estimates are that it was about 2% in the first decade of the 20th century. There's been steady and now explosive growth in intermarriage. In my parents' generation, intermarriage was unusual. In our generation, it was becoming much more common, but was still the exception. For our children, and even more now, intermarriage, as I say, is actually the norm. Among non-Orthodox American Jews, the most recent surveys suggest that 70% intermarry. For Orthodox Jews, who represent only 10% of American Jewry, the rate of intermarriage remains very, very low. Many Jews believe intermarriage is the greatest threat to American Jewish continuity and survival. Until recently, Jewish American leaders, including nearly all rabbis, focused discussion on how to prevent or discourage intermarriage. I disagree with this approach. While this approach may work to inhibit Orthodox youth, I think it is a foolish general strategy that I think is doomed to fail. It is, if anything, counterproductive among the non-Orthodox. To my mind, the issue is not how can we stop intermarriage. It should be what are we doing to engage the next generation. The challenge is how best to welcome and integrate those families into the Jewish community, and most importantly, how to nurture a Jewish identity in their children. In the Reform movement today, I'm happy to report that intermarriage is now approached with the goal of engaging intermarried families in Jewish life. I think there are reasons to be optimistic. A recent study in the Boston area showed that over 60% of the children of mixed marriages were being raised as Jews, typically with the encouragement and support of the non-Jewish parent. Conversion by the non-Jewish parent is still very much the exception. But in America today, thousands of children of mixed marriages are being raised as Jew with the support of the non-Jewish spouse. I suspect perhaps some of you on this call today, or with your children or grandchildren, proudly identify themselves as Jewish and have a parent who is not. I'm happy to report that my grandson Eli, now 15, celebrated a bar mitzvah when he was 13. I could tell you some other amusing tales about Eli, but I'll resist. Now, the first half of my book explores the puzzling nature of Jewish identity and the question of who should count as Jewish in America. Does it relate to a commitment to Judaism as a religion? One aspect of Judaism as a religion, which makes it a different kind of religion than most others, is it requires, there's no catechism. There are no required beliefs for Judaism. That's certainly not true of being an Episcopalian or a Muslim or a Catholic. Is being Jewish mean that you're part of a race? Is it a matter of blood involving distinctive physical or biological traits? Well, I have a chapter on the notion that Jews are a race, which I reject entirely. But of course, now with all the new genetic tests, unfortunately, I think more people are prepared to even think of it in terms of race. Are we, quote, a people who all share a common cultural or ethnic heritage? I find the notion of peoplehood appealing, but the question of boundaries, of who counts as part of the people, is a complicated one. In the book, I devote a chapter to analyzing, of course, the traditional matrilineal principle that said the traditional way of defining who counts as a Jew really asks the question, is your mother a Jew? If your mother was a Jew, then you're a Jew, irrespective of what you believe. In my research, I found, of course, that the matrilineal principle is of comparatively modern origin. It was not a biblical principle. In fact, the Bible is filled with stories of patriarchs whose spouses, at least initially, weren't Jewish, who were then accepted as part of the community, even though there was, at the time, no such thing as conversion. My book argues that being Jewish should be a matter of choice, not descent, and that I view the American Jewish community as a whole as being seen as a big tent with open flaps. Broadly inclusive, admission to the big tent should depend on public self-identification without reference to a parent's religion or formal religious conversion. In short, I end up arguing that for America, the test of who counts as part of the American Jewish community should depend on self-identification. Now, under the big tent, we've got all kinds of institutions, some religious, many non-religious. Because I'm a liberal, I think each of those institutions should have a right to define for themselves what they require in terms of membership. But none of the individual institutions under the big tent should be able to set the boundaries for the community as a whole. Now, under this big tent, today in America, there is just a stunning variety of both religious and non-religious institutions. The table is set with a rich smorgasbord of Jewish traditions, values, rituals, music, food, spiritual opportunity, and philanthropic causes. At this table, some will nibble, others will feast, but all will have options and none should be turned away. I believe the American Jewish community must embrace and celebrate this remarkable diversity and become much more welcoming. This, in my mind, will best sustain a strong sense of Jewish identity, given the challenges that I identify in the book. Now, I want to confess that for my parents' and grandparents' generation, anti-Semitism was a powerful force that encouraged Jews to seek shelter inside the tent. For young American Jews, I think this is no longer true. For most, notwithstanding the terrible events of the last few years, including the Pittsburgh murders, but for most young American Jews, they have never felt their educational, vocational, or social opportunities limited by institutionalized anti-Semitism. This was not true for my parents' or grandparents' generation. In America today, I believe the cost of proudly asserting our Jewishness is close to nil. The real question is, what are the forces to encourage us to remain? For some, caring about Israel and its survival is a compelling draw. But for others of us, it's an exhausting dilemma. Many Jews, notwithstanding their commitment to Israel's survival, and I am deeply committed to Israel's survival as a democratic and Jewish state, are dismayed by certain policies of the Israeli government. Some of these policies relate to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and my own prediction is in the next months, this is going to be much more anguishing for the American Jewish community, because I think there's a substantial probability that the new government headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to annex portions of the West Bank. The second source of conflict, apart from the treatment of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and to some extent in Israel proper, is the political power given to the Orthodox rabbinate within Israel to define for many purposes what within Israel counts as Judaism. These policies, by the way, fuel conflicts among American Jews between the Orthodox and the rest of us. They also risk alienating young Jews whom we most need to entice into the big tent. In conclusion, let me say that rather than intermarriage, I think the greatest challenge among American Jews is disengagement. Many Americans who proudly think of themselves as Jewish can't really give a coherent answer to the question, why is being Jewish important to you? Why is it meaningful to you? And to what extent does it affect how you live your life? Those who are religiously committed to Judaism have a direct answer. Religion is perhaps the most powerful force drawing people into the tent. And I wish I were religious. I wish I found the experience of ritual emotionally gratifying. I envy those who find deep meaning, comfort, and strength in their religious faith. And I envy them for having such a straightforward way, or so it seems to me, to articulate what they hope to pass on. For those of us who aren't religious, what makes being Jewish meaningful to us? I've struggled with this question. If my grandchildren asked me this question, what would I tell them? After much reflection, I've come to the conclusion that what I love most about being Jewish are three things: what I call the Jewish head, the Jewish heart, and the Jewish heritage. All three have roots in the religion. Let me say a word about each. By the Jewish head, I mean our people's commitment to education and the life of the mind. We are the people of the book. Our tradition encourages not just questioning and debate, but also analysis and interpretation. It's no coincidence that so many Jews have chosen intellectual professions. I take pride in this. By the Jewish heart, I mean our commitment to tikkun olam, a Hebrew phrase that means repairing the world. The concept today expresses our obligation to pursue social justice and make the world a better place through acts of kindness and compassion, particularly for the less privileged. An obligation to engage in social action to help heal the world. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that many of us who are not, in terms of ritual, religious, are in effect practicing our religion through our social commitments. I take great pride that in America, Jews have led many of the movements, the progressive movements, towards social reform. The third element is the Jewish heritage. I mean the remarkable 3,000-year-old story of the Jewish people, including our American Jewish story, which now extends back nearly 4 centuries. What a story it is. One of the great pleasures of working on this book was learning about American Jewish history, which I find quite moving. It's a story of survival that began long before my time, and I feel a part of it. The heritage is very rich. What I would tell my grandchildren is that I hope someday you connect to this story. And there's so many different ways you can see yourselves as part of it. Each of us who self-identifies as Jewish must choose what is most meaningful from our heritage. In a very real sense, I argue in my book that the chosen people must become the choosing people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Beautiful, and I can't wait till we get to our questions. And I want to remind you that we're going to, you can put questions in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Those will be monitored by Rich Gordon. You can also, we're going to try, since we're a familiar group, as I look through the faces, I'll open it up. And if you hit the, under the section where it says reactions, you can, I think there's a place where you can raise your hand. How do you do that, Rich?
The hand raise option is actually on the participants list. So they have to open up the participants list, and then on their own name.
Oh, I see it. Right.
Yeah, and there should be an option by their name to raise hand.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we'll go in that part. Before we continue, and I have a tremendous amount of questions, and I just, as you go through, the structure of this book is so incredible that it's hard to give voice to that in such a short time. We're going to explore more of that through questioning and doing this and some of the issues of identity. But what is profound, and I failed to mention this in the beginning, I got to the wrong page, but the first question of the Bible is, Ayecha, where are you? And scholars have tormented this question because it comes as a rhetorical question from God. God obviously knows, but the question really that the commentators say is, who are you? And I think today there's no better explanation or exploration of that in the series of questions that Professor presents for us. So we will unearth a little bit more as we go through questions. First, I want to call upon Leslie Maitland to share a little bit, to give us time to formulate our questions, but also to publicly thank her for her continued commitment to the Amram Scholar Series, for helping us pick out the best and most beautiful and most interesting of those that we presented as an option for our WHC virtual. And I think she's going to give you a little bit of what's coming in the future in terms of how she is quickly adapted to the world of post-COVID and has got great plans for us. So I turn it over to Leslie. But first, Leslie, I just want to thank you again for all your dedication to WHC and especially to your work on the Scholar Series.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lustig, and it's been so interesting for me over the years and so gratifying. But thank you, Professor Mnookin, and thanks to everybody who zoomed in to be with us today. I'm really, really sorry that we couldn't meet in our customary June Scholar Series reception as we had originally planned, but it's great that thanks to technology, we could still carry on and hear from our distinguished speaker. We are looking forward to continuing our Amram Scholar Series next fall, either in person or virtually as the situation requires. In fact, next month, I'll be attending a virtual Jewish Book Council conference where hundreds of authors are each allotted a precise 2-minute opportunity to audition. I participated in that experience from both sides as an author and as the temple's representative in choosing speakers in that fast-paced show of onstage skills. And I can hardly say which role represents the greater challenge. 2 minutes is not a lot of time to summarize your work and strut your stuff, but Bob Mnookin was a standout in last year's conference. And I can tell you inside that they are really strict about this. As you go, they hold up little cards that tell you you have 30 seconds left, 20 seconds left, and then you feel the feeling they're going to come out with the hook and drag you off if you go overboard. But that's what it's like. Meanwhile, over the summer, the temple has made it possible for everyone to explore offerings from seasons past. On Sundays at 10:30 a.m. on our Facebook page, we'll take you back to some of our favorites. Or if you're not on Facebook and you want to see more, check out our YouTube channel and explore the Amram Scholar Series playlists. Lastly, there's a link for ordering Professor Mnookin's important book on our website, and he'll be happy, he says, to send you a signed book plate to attach inside, our temporary means to hold a book sale and signing. So I thank you all for coming. Have a lovely summer and stay well. And now look forward to hearing your questions.
I want to begin. I found your book is fascinating, and there's such an incredible part where you, and is so relevant today. Could you explore, tell folks a little bit, because I don't think you'll give so much away. You begin with your personal experience of Erik Erikson and being in a study group or in a program with him, and you use Erik Erikson as the beginning of this. It's such a fascinating point, and what I found so beautiful about your book, and I said this before, the anticipatory behavior, you use these concrete examples which push the boundaries. It's clear of your negotiating skills and your law skills really help us, because it's such a logical progression that you go. Could you share a little bit about that Erik Erikson story?
Sure. It's quite a fascinating story. Erik Erikson, of course, is probably the person most identified with many concepts relating to identity in America today. While I was an undergraduate, he was a professor at Harvard, and he taught a course on identity. And I was lucky enough, as a young professor some years later, when I began my academic career at Berkeley, Erikson, when he retired from Harvard, moved to the Bay Area. And a psychoanalyst that I knew named Bob Wallerstein was a very close friend to Erikson, and he put together a study group of 10 scholars to meet with Erikson, who was thinking about some issues relating to identity in the final stage of life. Erikson's famous for really developing the notion that during a variety of stages of one's life, an individual faced different kinds of identity challenges. And indeed, for teenagers, the challenge he called an identity crisis. In all events, Erikson was someone who was born, turns out he was born in Germany, but his mother was Danish. And I had no notion of his Jewish ancestry, but during this faculty seminar, while it was meeting once a month, the New York Times in the 70s published a front page book review by a man named Berman of a group of essays written by Erikson. And in the book review, Berman said that Erickson himself had never come to grips with a basic issue relating to his own identity. That his mother was Jewish, that although his father was unknown, his mother had married a German doctor and he had been raised by this Dr. Hamburger. He had been bar mitzvahed. And yet, after he had come to America a few years later, he changed his name to Eric Erickson. He created his own last name. In fact, Berman said, he was his own father, so to speak, Eric Erickson. Well, at all events, this was actually a rather mean-spirited review that personally attacked Erickson for an absence of being or having appropriate integrity in terms of how he had lived his own life. And I think all of us in this seminar were kind of stunned by the review, and we didn't know quite how to respond. In fact, thereafter, the seminar sort of disbanded. And I was troubled by it all. I really wondered, was Erickson a self-hating Jew? What had been his problems with his own identity? And as part of this book, there's been a very good biography written of Erickson. I really tried to learn everything I could about the man. And among other things, I really posed the question. Erickson ended up marrying a Canadian woman who was not Jewish. And I really posed the question, why, if in fact he felt no connection or commitment to being Jewish, why was it necessarily wrong for him to no longer identify? It's not an easy question in my mind. In fact, I've really, in terms of my own notion of identity, I'm not an identity essentialist. I think we all have many strands to our identity. If I think about my own identity, they include a big part of my identity is I'm from Kansas City. Obviously, being Jewish is an important part of my identity now, too. Being a father and a grandfather, being a law professor, being someone who mediates, all of these are elements of my identity. And I think that during different periods of our life, different strands of our identity can assume greater or lesser importance. But I think this issue of what counts in terms of identity is a complicated one. And what makes it especially complicated in terms of being Jewish is being Jewish is part of a group. You're part of a group. And how that group considers you can affect the extent to which is easier or harder to think of yourself as Jewish. And of course, the Jewish group thinks of some people as Jewish, even though they may not think of themselves as Jewish because of the matrilineal principle. And other people who may think of themselves as Jewish and who self-identify, there's certainly Jews, including Orthodox Jews, who will say, well, if you haven't formally converted and your mother wasn't Jewish, we don't count you as a Jew. So it's very complicated and it's very interesting. And in the book, I try to use lots of examples. I mean, in fact, although this book is primarily addressed to our American community, I devote a chapter to who counts as a Jew in Israel. And I found out a lot of very interesting things. During the early years of Israel, of course, a key principle of the new Zionist state was that any Jew could make Aliyah and come to Israel. But in the early years, there was no definition of who counted as a Jew for purposes of immigration. And guess what the standard was? The standard was the same as the Mnookin test. It was self-identification. anyone who self-identified as a Jew was welcomed and could come. Of course, this was at a time when they were trying to build up the population. This later changed because it became, when an interior minister explicitly put into a regulation that those running the immigration program would not be allowed to ask people to demonstrate how they were Jewish, what evidence they had that their mother was Jewish. They had to take their word for it. And when that was made explicit, it had long been the practice. An Orthodox party that was part of Ben-Gurion's coalition at that time in the government rebelled, and all hell broke loose. But in all events, it's an interesting story. And I guess I must also add that in Israel today, a significant number, probably several 100,000 of people who are, quote, Jews in Israel are not halakhically Jews because they came from Russia and they've never formally converted and they did not have a Jewish mother. But they are really simply part of the Israeli secular Jewish community.
I'm going to mention, and I just want to ask you a question, because when you write about the puzzling nature of identity, and you have your paragraph of my own ideas of identity, especially Jewish identity, I wrote in the margin there a year ago that there's a problem using broken models. And I was going off of a concept in marriage, which is actually done by Judith Wallerstein, who I think was married to your friend. And I never, just until a minute ago, did I make that question.
Judy was a friend of mine too. You're exactly right. Judy was Bob's spouse.
Wow.
And she wrote a very good book about children of divorce.
Well,
yeah.
She also wrote The Good Marriage. She co-authored The Good Marriage and Making Relationships Last. And she makes her point in the sense the same way you do. We shouldn't look at broken models in order to find what works. We should be proactive and positive, which is so incredible in terms of this. I have a lot of questions of my own, but I don't want to monopolize, because I certainly could. I'm going to go to the screen and ask and see if there are any people if somebody has a question from the audience. If not, I will continue in my opportunity of having the great opportunity of sharing the dialogue. Oh, I see that Lou Weiner has a question. Lou, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Professor. Wonderful, wonderful lecture. You made the point that for the previous generation, anti-Semitism was a galvanizing force. We have seen over the last several years a steady uptick in anti-Semitism. What impact do you think that will have on the current generation in terms of their Jewish identity, and where do you think it will ultimately cause them to turn?
I think that's a very good question. And of course, I make no claims about being a prophet in that regard. I mean, when I began work on the book, in fact, my chapter on anti-Semitism really initially was going to argue that I thought anti-Semitism really wasn't particularly relevant in America anymore. In fact, events overtook me, and really shortly before the book came out, right about the time the book was coming out, there was Charlottesville, and this was after President Trump's election. And there's no question that there's been an increase in notions of white supremacy, including an increased growth of anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I think it's very important that we keep in mind the big picture. And the big picture is that I think for most young people, when they think about their educational, economic, and social opportunities and their political opportunities, I don't think today they think that anti-Semitism is going to be an enormous constraint. There can be anybody who thinks there are no anti-Semites in America is crazy, because we all know there are anti-Semitic incidents, that there are graves that are defaced, there are Jewish monuments that are sometimes defaced, there are things sometimes scrawled in school bathrooms that are anti-Semitic. And then there are some terrible things like Pittsburgh, which are more serious, where they're really literally violent attacks on Jews. But on the other hand, I'm struck by the incredible changes in America. And I don't think those changes are going to be reversed. In my grandparents' generation, there were whole industries Jews could not go into. Not long before I was in law school, there were still some law firms that wouldn't hire Jews. There was, as I reported, my high school had a quota. I don't think those things are going to come back. I think constant vigilance is the word. We shouldn't become too complacent. But my impression, and I have to confess this is a subjective impression, is that among the young people I know as my students, they're of course aware of these anti-Semitic acts when they occur, but I don't think it's a very salient part of their lives.
So before we continue on, and I want to get to another, there are a couple of hands up, just as long as we're on anti-Semitism and being in both the academic world and being so proactive in democracy in Israel, which you have been in your work in NGOs. And I want to see if, as you describe your friend Udi in Israel said, they're Jewish sparks that have been lit inside of you. You give this beautiful account of one of the men that you worked with. What is your feeling about and have been of BDS on the campus, since you have a first window and Harvard is often, several of the Ivy Leagues are often a hotbed of some of these issues?
I think that what's very complicated is in academic circles today, there's a considerable amount of hostility towards certain Israeli governmental practices. And I think that there are a number of people who I think could be fairly characterized as anti-Zionist. And that is, they don't like the idea of a Jewish state where Jewish people have special standing in Israel. Now, I personally am committed to Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state. I'm very troubled by the treatment of Palestinians within Israel. The amount spent on education for Palestinians is Arab Israelis is a fraction of what's spent generally for Jews. And I think there's plenty to criticize. But on the other hand, Israel's great challenge, and the great challenge, it's what strikes me is how different the challenges are facing the American Jewish community and facing Israel. Israel's great challenge in my mind is how to preserve its own security in a very complicated neighborhood while maintaining its democratic values. How does it manage being both Jewish and democratic? In America, our greatest challenge, I think, really relates to how we best can invite and encourage the next generation to develop a strong Jewish identity.
So that leads us to our next question. I'm going to call on Richard Herzog. Go ahead, Richard.
Yes, thank you so much for this interesting examination at both a macro and a micro level of the situation of Jews in America. You point to numbers which would indicate a substantial majority of the non-Jewish parents in intermarriages apparently agree to the raising of the children as Jewish. I think your number was something like 63% of children in such marriages, which would imply something close to that as a percentage of the non-Jewish parents. I'm wondering whether you have an explanation for that. It's a very striking pattern.
It is a striking pattern, and I think a part of it relates to, for many of the non-Jewish parents, while they were really raised in another religion and still may be modestly observant, many of them are not deeply religious and not deeply committed to their own religion, first. Second, I think there's so much about Judaism, particularly Reform Judaism, that is appealing and open-minded, where even though they're not converting, I think that there's not a great deal. There are some things that probably make them at times uncomfortable, but I think there's, theologically, there's not a great deal that they would find offensive. And I think there's a great deal in terms of Jewish cultural and religious traditions that they find appealing. On the other hand, going through a formal religious conversion is another thing. I mean, I give an example in the book of the wife of a colleague of mine with whom I've taught, who I think grew up as a Presbyterian, and she married a Jew. They had 2 children. They raised their boys as Jewish, and they were both bar and bat mitzvah, and they celebrated the basic Jewish holidays, but she never converted. Sadly, she was stricken by cancer and survived, but after several years, it got very serious, the cancer, and she was admitted to hospice care. She had a hospice nurse. And the hospice nurse asked her, you know, just as part of the introductory interview, "What's your religion?" And she initially said none. And the nurse, you know, probably like many Christian Americans, really aren't comfortable with the idea that someone has no religion. So she, so this woman, when she saw the look on the hospice nurse's face, after a pause, she said, "Put down, I'm Jewish." And my friend said that it brought tears to his eyes. And she, in fact, had a Jewish service after she died. She never converted. But as was said at this service, you know, this woman had actively participated in this congregation's life. She had raised 2 kids who had been bar mitzvahed. And I find it wrong not to think of someone like that as part of our community. Actually, one of the great pleasures since I wrote my book a very nice rabbi in Los Angeles. I gave a talk in Los Angeles. I've given a couple talks in LA. He was a Reform rabbi, and his congregation had a very successful, this is a little unusual, had a very successful religious day school. So it was a Reform religious day school. And a teacher in that school who was not Jewish asked if she could send her daughter to the school. And the rabbi said, well, he and the board, they had a policy that to be in the school, you had to be Jewish. And he said, after reading my book, he changed his position. And he told this teacher that, of course, her child could go. I liked that.
Right.
I mean, it made me feel very good. I mean, just in terms of broadening the definition.
I think that this is so important, and I'm going to get to, I know Katie has a question, and I know Gabrielle Bruno has a question as well, and we'll get to those, but I want to follow through a little bit because your profession is in the legal field is as a negotiator, and you obviously teach negotiating skills. And I think back to as I was developing our own policy, I met with a kid who I was a young adult, I should say, who I was so close with, and it came to me and I said, I'd love to do your marriage. I'm working on the policy, but we're not there yet. And she ended up doing her business school thesis on negotiating skills with everything she talked about in negotiating with large corporations. She used as her case study interfaith couples. And so I want to ask you about this because in this openness, in this self-proclamation, in this questions that we have of where do we set the borders and the parameters, and you look at peoplehood, you look at bloodlines, you look at identity, you look at self-proclamation, you look at being proclaimed, and you rightly so take that our identities are construct over time. How do you see the negotiation and the process in this thing of securing the Jewish future? And you've gone through that personally in your own family, and your motivation, as you say in this, was not so much about what was important for you and Dale in the sense, but the continuity of the Jewish people about providing an opportunity for inspiring the next generation. Talk to us, negotiator.
Well, listen, I certainly don't have I don't claim to have the answers, and I can't, obviously. One of the editors who read the first draft of my book said, well, there's a problem with your book. You don't tell people how you think they should be Jewish. And I said, you don't understand. The whole theme of my book is I don't want to tell people that I think in America there are a lot of different ways of doing it. You don't understand my book. Anyway, I worked that out, needless to say. But you're right. I mean, these topics involve issues of negotiation all the time. Within the Jewish community, think about all the conflicts we have. You know, Arnie Eisen, who was a friend of mine at Stanford when I taught at Stanford, is head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He said, in New York, Orthodox rabbis will not appear on a panel with him, you know, in terms of having conversations about the community. I hope that's not true in Washington, D.C., but I think it's a problem. I mean, the extent to which we Jews judge each other. And indeed, I have to say, within my own family, my mother, I was a product of a mixed marriage. My mother's family were German Jews, Rabbi Lustig, like you, who had been in America for quite a while. And I would characterize my mother's attitude towards Orthodox Jews as being affirmatively hostile, intolerant. Looking back at it, you know, and my mother was a marvelous woman who was a great liberal in almost all respects you can imagine. but not so much with respect to some other Jews. And you see this, I see this among my friends. One of the most interesting things for me is since I worked on this book, I offered a seminar for 3 years at Harvard Law School. Believe it or not, it just shows you in your tenure how much freedom you can have. I offered a seminar on negotiating Jewish identity. You know, I had about 20 kids a year in this seminar, including for the first time in my life, several Haredim. Harvard Law School, about 10 years ago, started accepting some kids where truth be, they're men, they're not women, who do not really have a college degree. They had studied at a yeshiva, but they'd taken the law school aptitude tests. And now some of these yeshivas give a phony, some kind of degree. They call it a university degree, but they're not. I mean, because they really spent all their time studying the Talmud. But I had in my class, each of these years, 2 or 3 kids who were Haredim. And I had never known any ultra. I'd never known personally any, well, you know, Haredim. I think they prefer not to be called ultra Orthodox. It was an incredibly interesting experience for me. And they were absolutely fascinated. They loved the seminar because, of course, I was teaching a lot of stuff about American Jewish history. I was teaching them a lot of things that they'd never been taught. I thought they would be, of course, well-educated culturally about all things Jewish. It's not true. Their education in many ways was extremely narrow, but they were interested. And anyway, I learned a lot too. It was quite fascinating. I'll give one anecdote. In talking about marriage, you know, I said that in old times, among observant Jews, there were arranged marriages. And there were women who, you know, played this role. And one of these guys raises his hand. He says, "What do you mean, the old days?" And this guy happened to be single. And he said, "Every weekend I go back to New York. Every week I am sent resumes of Orthodox Jewish women that I'm supposed to consider to take out." So some of the women in the class, some of whom, of course, were not Jewish and some of whom were, said, "Oh, come on, let us see the resumes." And he showed them some of the resumes, and these girls started saying, "Oh, she's very cute. What about her?" But it was very interesting how, in fact, their lives are still very different. Very different.
So I'm going to turn, I hope that, is Katie still on?
Yeah, we're here.
Go ahead. Katie, you had a question?
Yeah, well, it's mostly my husband Zach's question, but I just, I wanted to say that I got your book a while ago and I really enjoyed it. And I was excited when I saw that you were going to be giving a talk in this series. And I'm happy that it happened despite a global pandemic. So I just wanted to say that before my husband asks his question.
Oh yeah, I'm along for the ride mostly. But so my question is about, you were touching on it a bit, but about doctrinal divisions bleeding into identitarian divisions. And primarily the reason for that, or that I'm concerned about there being some kind of real deep sociological division between American Jews, is political. So one facet of modernity in like the Jewish political experience that I find really interesting is that there's a growing divide between the Orthodox and everybody else when it comes to politics, with the reform movement and the conservative movement becoming, as or rather more accurately staying and remaining politically liberal, and the Orthodox not only representing a larger percentage of American Jews, but becoming an increasingly conservative one, more closely aligned with the Republican Party and integrated with Republican political infrastructures and involved in party politics and so on. So my question is, how do you see this increasingly stark division inside the Jewish community affecting the notion of a shared American Jewish identity? What is it? Does it, you know, in some religions, you've seen actual splits over political, social, moral issues that touch on these kind of identity divides. And you see these huge gulfs between mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants that center primarily on politics rather than theology. So I'm wondering how you think the sort of entry of political divisions into the intra-Jewish division in the United States will change our identity going down the line.
Well, that's a really interesting, that's a great question. And your observation is, of course, correct as a generalization. Today, Orthodox Jews, on average, are much more committed to Israel and are much more committed to Likud and the center right and the right of Israeli politics. And you're also right that many of the rest of us are very uncomfortable with some aspects of Israeli politics. And you're quite right too, that in terms of American politics, overall, I think that about 70% of American Jews voted for Hillary Clinton, 30% voted for President Trump. But I think the proportions among the Orthodox were almost the reverse. I mean, I think more than a majority voted for Trump. And in terms of divisions, of course, given the extent of intermarriage, now many Orthodox won't marry the children of many of the rest of us, or they might not, short of a conversion. So the divide is very real. I think, though, that the other thing, though, although as a generalization it's true, what's also true, and this is true in Israel too. In Israel, I have met any number of observant Jews who are religiously observant, and by that I mean what we characterize as Orthodox, who are politically progressive. And the same is true in America. There are Orthodox Jews who are very much liberals along many social and political issues. Your question of sort of what's going to happen to this divide, I just, I can't really say. I think as someone interested in negotiation, I mean, I guess what I think is very important is that we remain open to views that are very different than our own, and not seek to exclude those with whom we politically disagree. Moreover, I think, as someone interested in negotiation, I always try to get people to focus on what their underlying interests are and what their underlying values are. And often on those levels, people share a lot along many dimensions. But you're quite right. You're quite right that the divide between the Orthodox and everyone else is getting increasingly stark in America.
So I want to follow up because I think if I understood, and I'm going to, Zach can respond to this, is that, Professor Mnookin, in one of your, in your chapter about peoplehood, you lay out beautifully what are your 5 points, and your fifth point is shared political and economic support for the state of Israel. Jews worldwide should demonstrate solidarity by supporting the state of Israel, the Jewish homeland. In America today, this support takes many forms, and you go through it. But the question that I think is, and now I'm going to get to the title of your book, paradox, in terms of, and Zach, jump in, because I don't want to take over your question in this sense, but I want to ask this because the paradox that one of the things that we see that's happening here is that we are, de Tocqueville described us as, that in democracy, his understanding of democracy that the individual is so paramount, and that's so ingrained, and so much so that, you know, Alvin Reines wrote his response to that, Polidoxy, that we really are a merging of our American values and Jewish values that has created a new American religion. And so we can talk about that, but I think what, Zach, is happening is that when our core values, both as a political values and Jewish values, are bifurcated by choices by other Jews, how do we contend with that, and how do we deal with that for the future? And it's a real problem, because self-identification and your concept of the big tent doesn't really talk about how do we deal with our divergence.
With our different.
No, that's right. And I think I didn't intend to bring up Israel in the question, but I think it's actually an important way of spotlighting what both of you are talking about. And we can put this in immediate concrete terms, because in the next month or so, as has been discussed, Israel plans on annexing large chunks of the West Bank. And for a lot of politically progressive Jews, this is crossing a Rubicon, right? It is a destruction of the two-state solution, and our understanding of what it means to be pro-Israel means supporting a two-state solution. So this shared consensus surrounding support for Israel in the American Jewish community will have lost what really has been, both in political terms and in communitarian terms, a central plank that bridged the gaps inside the community and how we understand our relationship to Israel. So I guess maybe, without having to project too far in the future, right, just talking about this July, assuming the current government follows through with what it promises to do, what can this individual communal model that Rabbi Lustig was just talking about and that you've highlighted in the book, what does that tell us about the likely ramifications for this very important part of our shared American Jewish identity?
You see, I think one of the issues that one of the things I believe, I described what I thought was the central challenge to Israel and the central challenge to the United States, and how they're different for the two Jewish communities. And these are the two great Jewish communities in the world today. But the two interact. I mean, I think to the extent Netanyahu believes that the support of the American Jewish community is not particularly relevant anymore because the evangelicals are more supportive of the notion of greater Israel, I think he's crazy. Because I think, in fact, the support, political and economic, of the American Jewish community has been indispensable to Israel's security and its economic prosperity over the years, and I think it remains terribly important. On the other hand, I think how Israel manages these issues that relate to democracy and tolerance and the treatment of the other have a profound effect on our challenge, because it makes it harder for us to attract the younger generation of American Jews to the extent that they find Israel an embarrassment, that the Jewish state they find is inconsistent with what they see as their core Jewish and American values. When I was on the board of the New Israel Fund, I remember having a very interesting discussion with a brilliant Israeli academic, where I said to her that for American Jews, there is such a, particularly for Reform and conservative Jews, there's really a conflation and integration of what we see as our Jewish values and our American values. And, you know, she said, she was a secular Israeli Jew, and she says, what do you mean? She says, Jewish values mean women sit in the balcony, there aren't any rabbis. She characterized as Jewish values some of the most troubling aspects of orthodoxy. And I said, well, that's a real difference between Israel and the United States. Because the United States, I'm sure, you know, my guess is in your congregation, people have the same sense that I do largely. I mean, the one thing, my formal religious education as a Midwestern Reform Jew and educated in the 50s was thin, as I acknowledge. But boy, the notion of tikkun olam, the notion of one's obligation to help heal the world, boy, was that driven in. I mean, that was really a value that was very reinforced. And also notions of philanthropy and some other things in terms of those who are less privileged. But anyway, but your question is a really powerful one. And what it's going to do to the American community in terms of divisions in the years to come, it's hard, you know. Okay.
These are really critical questions, and I'm going to tell you, you've now faced what I faced. Zach was one of my bar mitzvah students, as along with Leslie's daughter, Ariel, and her son, Zach. And if you want to be on your toes, you should have this caliber of kids. They do this. So I want to tell you, after those kids over the years, I have 4 questions I ask every B'nai Mitzvah student. And I think it's relevant here in speaking to you. And that is that first I ask them, you know, these are questions that they're going to ask their family, or I give them a list that they're going to do. And one is what is the meaning of bar or bat mitzvah? You know, and what is the meaning of bar by mitzvah? The second part of that question, what does my becoming a bar mitzvah mean to you? And then the third question is, how does being Jewish, this is what they have to ask their parents, affect your daily life?
Good for you. That's the question.
You'll love the last question. And I already tell them that the answer to this can't be because I will kill you. The last is the parents have to tell their kids, tell me why I should remain Jewish. Because what your book pretends or tells us and asks us in your concept that goes in line with great thinkers within the Jewish community, Rabbi Alexander Avashalom, who was the head of the Reform movement, Lydia Kukoff, who created the book Choosing Judaism and created a paradigm about us being Jews of choice and Jews that choose. Your book asks this question about the context of the relationship to identity and meaning. You link this, which for me I find so gratifying. You link, as you talked in your paradigm of head, heart, and heritage, you link this idea of what it is that we have to have a meaningful, we can't just declare our Judaism. And so I'd like you, in conclusion, to perhaps talk a little bit about this, because you went from somebody who was educated and brought up in a Jewish congregation at B'nai Yehuda, B'nai Jeshurun, just like I was in Nashville, Tennessee, that was part of prophetic Judaism. And the obligations were to be a good human being and a good individual. And you moved from that, but the questions of your daughters about that your Judaism couldn't be just by declaration, but had to be of action. And here you were on Hillel International. You've worked on the Jewish Fund, New Jewish Fund. You're involved in all of these aspects. In the latter part of your life, you've become the paradigmatic Jewish involved individual. So how do we link that declaration to meaning? And how, in this thing, will you talk a little bit about how do we translate to our children?
Well,
very Jewish to ask only 30 questions in one question.
No, I understand. And those are all really big questions. And I think those are questions that people have to answer for themselves. And I'm in no position to tell other people how to do it. What I hoped was, in writing this book and describing my own journey, others might find aspects of it that they could relate to, and they find some of my thinking and analysis helpful. But I think, though, that your last point, I mean, the questions you posed, I think are absolutely, the really important questions. And at the very end of my book, I describe that a former student of mine really helped me articulate something close to what you just said, because you had articulated
Page
it.
227.
You've got it. She was engaged, as I reported, to a Jewish man and was in the process of converting to Judaism. And to support the transition, her rabbi recommended that she engage in 3 sorts of activities each week. One involved study, a second involved having a Jewish experience, and the third involved community engagement with other Jews. And in the final paragraphs of my book, I describe how, by this rabbi too, each of those things could be interpreted very broadly. So it wasn't necessarily a particular way you had to do it. But I think that rabbi's challenge is really a useful one, because for each of us to sort of think about as we're living our lives, what difference is it making in terms of how I'm living my life and what I'm doing that I consider myself an American Jew? I guess maybe it's because I'm a law professor, but I think sometimes having the right questions is very valuable, even if you don't necessarily can't give answers to them that are going to be the same for everybody. Most of all, though, I just, in closing, want to thank you for having me. This has been very stimulating for me, and I appreciate very much the kind things you said about the book. And I hope some members of your congregation are stimulated by the book too.
Well, I want to thank you so much, not only for providing us this opportunity, but I highly recommend this book. And I want to dovetail this in a sense, because you start off with the questions of developmental psychology and Erikson's personal life and life story. And you also bring in, you systematically, as a good professor of law, go in and set up what the question is, what the examples are, and what the pros and cons of each. And at each chapter, you then review the critical questions of that and often delineate your own thinking in very short and concise ways, which us as rabbis never do. But in every case, it is an outstanding book, one chapter after another. In fact, I think it's one of the books that we should turn into one of our study sessions at the congregation. It asks such critical questions. I highly recommend this because not only is it ask good questions, but it's so phenomenally engaging. Your personal stories, and you're making this so real, and your use of so much broad material. And it's, for me as a rabbi on the inside of the organized Jewish world, asking these questions, it was so refreshing to know that these questions resonate also from, if you will, the other side, from somebody who is going on the struggle and on the journey towards meaning. You quote one of my favorite sources, and somebody, even though we totally disagree on so many things, Lord Jonathan Sacks. Every reflective human being, he says, will ask sometime in his or her life, who am I, why am I here, and how shall I live? Which is the question that I wanted to start with, Ayecha, when God asks us, where are you? God is really asking us, who are you? And God determines who we are, not but what we say or what we pray, but what we do. And your example has articulated that we must struggle and we must search to live up to our name, Israel. I want to thank you. I want to thank Leslie Maitland for providing this incredible opportunity. It takes a mind like hers to be able in 2 minutes to pick out a jewel like you. And Leslie, you've done it once again, as you've always done. I want to thank you for all that you do for us. We look forward to it. Leslie is going to be going through our, Leslie will be going through and at the council and coming up with new things. We'll be meeting and talking about perhaps over the summer having other opportunities. I want to thank everybody who did this. I want to thank Rich for this, and especially to you, Professor. Thank you for both your book and the time that you gave us this evening. We wish you and Dale your two daughters, Jennifer and I think Allison, was it?
Yes.
And we also look forward to hear Eli's accounts and future tales of a grandfather. But we wish you safety, good health, and thank you again for this opportunity of the book.